Picture this, a country with 1.4 billion people, some of the most extreme wealth on the planet, and yet persistent, widespread poverty. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating structural realities of the Indian economy. We're going to take what is essentially a dense university syllabus and translate it into the real-world story of a rapidly changing, dynamic nation. We'll be looking at how this massive, mixed developing economy actually functions on the ground and what it's going to take to steer a nation of this size toward a fully developed future. Let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with the Indian economy paradox, look at the population debate, dive into agriculture, track the major policy shifts, and finally, look ahead to the road to 2047. So, part 1. Let's look at a central contradiction that completely defines modern India. Now, it's pretty wild to think about, but India is actually the 5th largest economy in the world by nominal GDP. They recently even surpassed their former colonizer, the United Kingdom. So by absolute numbers, it's a total global economic powerhouse. But here's the catch. It still battles severe underdevelopment. Globally, it's still categorized as an emerging or developing economy. So you might be wondering, how can a country have so much aggregate wealth, yet still struggle with such widespread poverty? Well, it really comes down to the sheer size of the population. When you divide all that wealth by 1.4 billion people, the per capita income, meaning the average wealth per person, remains quite low compared to fully developed nations. This brings up a really crucial distinction: the massive difference between economic growth and economic development. Economic growth is purely quantitative. It's just numbers. It means building more factories and increasing the gross output. But economic development, that's qualitative. That asks the hard, real-world questions. Are the workers inside those factories actually healthier? Is the education system truly equipping young people for the modern world? Is wealth inequality actually shrinking? Growth is absolutely a necessary starting point, for sure. But as we see in the Indian context, all the quantitative growth in the world doesn't just automatically translate into deep qualitative development for your average citizen. To really understand why this underdevelopment is so sticky, we have to look at economist Ragnar Nerksi's vicious circle of poverty. And guys, this isn't just some abstract theory. This is a punishing, relentless, real-world loop. Imagine a rural family. Their low income means every single rupee they earn goes strictly toward basic survival, just food and shelter. Because of that, step 2 hits: zero savings. In step 3, because they have no savings, they literally cannot invest in better tools or higher quality seeds or education for their kids. And because they can't make those investments, we hit step 4. Their productivity remains permanently low, which leads them right back to low income. Breaking this cycle is practically impossible without massive external interventions like targeted government welfare or huge infrastructure investments. Moving on to section 2, let's see how India's massive population plays into this economic loop. In 2023, India actually surpassed China to become the most populous country in the entire world, sitting at over 1.4 billion people. Historically, this was driven by a rapid decline in the death rate, thanks to better modern medicine, without a matching decline in the birth rate. In the real world, this places an enormous everyday weight on literally everything. It severely strains natural resources, land, water, and local urban infrastructure, like the housing grids and hospitals. But flip that coin, and you'll see an incredible geopolitical advantage. The median age in India is just 28 to 29 years old. While major economies in Europe and East Asia are rapidly aging and shrinking, India has one of the youngest populations on the entire planet. This demographic can be a massive asset, commonly known as a demographic dividend. It translates to a huge, highly energetic working-age labor force. If these young people can be kept healthy, educated, highly skilled, and crucially employed, they have the potential to completely skyrocket the nation's savings and investment rates. But here's where we hit a massive hurdle: unemployment. And in India, it takes on some very specific, somewhat hidden forms. Take disguised unemployment, for example. Imagine a tiny family farm, maybe just 2 acres. 5 people work that land every single day. But the actual crop yield would be exactly the same if only 3 people worked it. So those extra 2 workers look employed, but their actual economic output, what economists call their marginal productivity, is effectively zero. They are trapped in agriculture simply because the industrial and service sectors just haven't created enough jobs to absorb them. And compounding this is a deeply frustrating modern challenge: educated unemployment. This is a distinctly Indian phenomenon, where a university graduate literally cannot find a job because their theoretical, classroom-based education doesn't match up with the practical, vocational skills the modern market actually demands. You'll constantly see headlines where thousands of university degree holders are applying for just a handful of basic entry-level clerical jobs. It's a severe structural mismatch. You've got a booming tech sector desperate for skilled workers and millions of educated youth sitting on the sidelines. Okay, that brings us to Section 3, focusing on the literal backbone of the economy, agriculture. If you look at GDP contributions, the modern Indian economy has undergone a huge transformation. The services sector, so we're talking IT, finance, telecommunications, that now drives over half of India's entire economy. Meanwhile, the agricultural sector contributes only about 18% to the national wealth. What is really wild about this is that India essentially leapfrogged the traditional industrial manufacturing phase altogether to become a service-driven powerhouse. That is incredibly unusual for a developing country, which usually relies heavily on building factories to generate middle-class wealth. But hold on to that 18% figure for a second, because despite agriculture producing only 18% of the country's wealth, anywhere from 42 to 45% of India's entire workforce is still tied to farming. Let that sink in. Nearly half the country is sharing just 18% of the economic pie. This immense occupational imbalance is the root cause behind why rural poverty and that disguised unemployment we talked about are still so incredibly persistent today. To really grasp modern farming in India, we have to rewind a bit to the Green Revolution. Back in the 1960s, India was actually highly dependent on foreign food aid. To survive, they initiated a massive shift spearheaded by scientist Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. By bringing in scientifically developed high-yielding variety, or HYV seeds, along with chemical fertilizers and modern irrigation, India miraculously transitioned from a struggling food deficit nation into a triumphant food surplus, self-sufficient one. It was an absolute lifeline for a rapidly growing population. But as with most things, this revolution came with heavy long-term costs. The successes were obvious. India avoided famine and created massive wheat and rice surpluses. The failures, however, are deeply felt today. Those HYV seeds, they were incredibly water-intensive. In states like Punjab and Haryana, this led to catastrophic groundwater depletion and soil degradation from all the chemical overuse. Plus, it created massive regional imbalances. Basically, only the large farmers who could afford the expensive fertilizers and tractors truly benefited. Small farmers were often driven into crippling debt just trying to keep up, which severely widened the wealth gap. Let's pivot to part 4 and see how the government stepped in to reshape the nation's trajectory. The modern Indian economy as we know it was truly born out of a massive life-or-death crisis. In 1991, India faced a severe balance of payments crisis. The government literally had only 2 weeks of foreign exchange reserves left to pay for essential imports, like oil. I want you to really think about that. 2 weeks away from total national bankruptcy. The country was on the absolute brink of a sovereign default. The old model of a heavily state-controlled, inward-looking economy had completely collapsed. So with their backs against the wall, this existential crisis forced the famous LPG reforms, architected by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. They brought in liberalization, dismantling the infamous license rod. Just imagine literally needing government permission just to buy a new office chair or increase your factory output. They initiated privatization, selling off inefficient public sector enterprises. And they finally embraced globalization, opening up to foreign direct investment, reducing tariffs, and integrating with the rest of the world. This was the absolute turning point that unleashed India's modern growth. Fast forward to 2015, and we see another huge tectonic shift in the institutions. For 65 years, India's economy was guided by the Planning Commission, which used a very rigid top-down approach, centrally handing out funds to states. Well, that was scrapped and replaced by Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog actually has no power to allocate funds. Instead, it's a modern advisory think tank designed to foster bottom-up planning. It brings the state chief ministers right to the table to create true cooperative federalism, radically shifting the power dynamic. It turns individual states into active partners, rather than just waiting around for central directives. And finally, part 5. Let's look at the roadmap for India's future. Today, India's domestic policy is heavily aligned with global targets. Niti Aayog acts as the nodal agency monitoring the UN's Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. But India has cleverly merged this global 2030 call to end poverty with its own ultimate domestic deadline of 2047. That initiative is known as Viksit Bharat, or Developed India, and the goal is a total economic transformation by the momentous 100th anniversary of its independence. The vision for 2047 is massive. It aims for zero absolute poverty through inclusive growth. It places a huge emphasis on Nari Shakti, or women-led development, finally recognizing that you absolutely cannot reach your true economic potential without full female participation. And crucially, it targets total self-reliance, Atmanirbhar Bharat, by boosting domestic manufacturing through the Make in India initiative. Remember how we talked about India leapfrogging the industrial phase? Well, this is their massive attempt to retrospectively build that missing manufacturing base, ensuring they become a global manufacturing hub, not just a massive consumer of imports. If we zoom out, this timeline perfectly summarizes the entire grand journey of the Indian economy. We start all the way back with a strictly state-controlled economy in 1950, then surviving the huge shock of the 1991 LPG reforms to finally join the global market, shifting the governance model entirely in 2015 with Niti Aayog, and now they are fully sprinting toward the ultimate goal of achieving developed nation status by 2047. So, it all comes down to this one critical question. Will India's 1.4 billion people yield a historic demographic dividend, or will they buckle under the weight into a demographic disaster? The policies are written, the ambitious goals are set, but real-world execution is literally everything. We're all left to watch incredibly closely as the world's largest population writes its next, most important economic chapter.